Welcome to cozy mystery stories, where the pursuit of knowledge turns deadly. In the heart of Cambridge, Massachusetts, a fierce blizzard traps 5 of Harvard's most brilliant and ambitious minds within the home of the eminent Professor Alistair Finch. They have all gathered for the unveiling of a legendary lost diary, a document that could make or break their careers. But when the professor is found dead in his own library, the priceless manuscript becomes a testament to murder. The fire in Professor Alistair Finch's library spat and crackled, a cheerful, defiant sound against the vindictive howl of the blizzard that had descended upon Cambridge with the fury of a biblical plague. Outside, the world had vanished into a vortex of swirling white. Inside, however, was a world preserved in amber and old leather, a sanctuary of knowledge where every volume on the towering mahogany shelves represented a life's work, a forgotten argument, or a whispered secret. It was, I have always found, in such places of supposed enlightenment that the darkest of human passions tend to fester. For knowledge, my dear reader, is power, and the pursuit of power is a most treacherous game. We were 6, marooned on this academic island. Our host, Professor Finch, was a man carved from old ivory, brittle and yet immensely valuable. At 75, his mind remained a razor, though his body had begun to betray him, confining him mostly to the magnificent winged armchair that served as his throne. His eyes, pale and watery, missed nothing. They swept over his guests now with a look of theatrical satisfaction, the collector admiring his most prized, and perhaps most dangerous acquisitions. There was Dr. Julian Croft, whose charm was as polished as his expensive brogues. He was a historian of the new school, a television personality whose books sold in quantities that made his more traditional colleagues, like Finch, sniff with disdain. Yet here he was, smiling, his glass of sherry held aloft, his ambition a palpable heat in the room. He was a man who one suspected would cheerfully plagiarize an epitaph if it suited his needs. Beside him, a stark contrast, sat Dr. Elena Vance. She was Finch's protégée, a young woman with the severe beauty of a classical statue and an intellect that was said to rival the master's own. Her devotion to Finch was legendary, a fierce, almost filial piety that some whispered was not entirely academic. She watched the old man with an anxious intensity, as if she could will the strength back into his frail limbs. Then there was Mr. Sterling Blackwood, the only one amongst us without a string of letters after his name. His power was of a different, more tangible sort. He was a trustee of the university, a man whose family fortune was as old and storied as Harvard itself. He sat with the stolid patience of a man accustomed to waiting for others to come to him, his presence a silent reminder that it is wealth, not wisdom, that ultimately keeps the lights on in the hallowed halls of learning. His interest in the evening's proceedings was opaque, his gaze heavy and appraising. And in a corner, almost blending into the shadows cast by a looming bookshelf, was Dr. Beatrice Holloway. An archivist from the university's rarer collections, she was a creature of dust and silence. Her clothes seemed chosen to render her invisible, her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much, yet revealed too little, and she nursed a small glass of water as if it were a shield. She had been invited, Finch had explained, for her unparalleled expertise in authenticating 17th century manuscripts. Finally, there was myself, Penelope Dunn, a journalist. I was ostensibly there to write a glowing profile of Professor Finch for a prestigious London periodical, a final laurel for a celebrated career. In truth, I was there because I smelled a story far more compelling than a simple hagiography. Finch had summoned us all with a tantalizing promise. He had acquired the lost diary of Thomas Thorne, a disgraced governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, who, it was whispered, had documented a conspiracy that reached the very heart of the colony's founding fathers. Such a document, if authentic, would rewrite history. For Julian Croft, it would be a career-defining scoop, For Elena Vance, it would be the triumphant capstone of her mentor's legacy. For Sterling Blackwood, whose ancestors were implicated in Thorne's Circle, it could be a catastrophic stain on his family's name. For Beatrice Holloway, well, her stake was as yet unclear, but her presence was no accident. One must always consider the little grey cells, and mine were tingling with the possibilities. "The telephone lines, I'm afraid, are quite dead," Finch announced, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. "And the snow, as you can see, has made prisoners of us all. A rather dramatic setting, wouldn't you agree, for the unveiling of a lifetime's discovery?" He smiled, a thin, knowing expression. "It ensures I have a captive audience." "Alastair, you always did have a flair for the dramatic," Julian Croft said with a smooth laugh, though his eyes darted towards the windows, a flicker of unease in their depths. "When do we get to see this legendary diary?" Finch's smile widened. "Patience, my dear Julian, all in good time. Great discoveries, like fine port, must be savoured." He gestured with a trembling hand towards a decanter on a nearby table. "Elena, my dear, would you do the honours? A glass for myself, and please serve our guests." Elena rose with silent grace, her movements precise and economical. As she poured the rich, ruby liquid, the atmosphere in the room grew thick with unspoken tensions. Each person in that library was a rival, a competitor in a field where reputation was currency, and a single discovery could elevate one to immortality or condemn another to obscurity. The Thorne Diary was not merely a historical artifact. It was a weapon, and we were all locked in the armory together. Professor Finch took the glass Elena offered him, his gnarled fingers closing around it. He took a slow, deliberate sip. "Ah," he sighed, a sound of deep satisfaction, "to history, and to the secrets it has yet to yield." He looked from face to face, his pale eyes lingering on each of us in turn, a silent toast that felt more like a challenge, or perhaps even a threat. The wind shrieked, rattling the window panes like a vengeful spirit, and the lights flickered once, twice, before holding steady. It was an omen, surely. For in that grand, silent library, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 scholars, the final chapter of Alastair Finch's life was about to be written. And as is so often the case, the ink it would be written in was blood. The hours that followed crawled by with the leaden pace of a funeral procession. Conversation was stilted, a series of academic skirmishes veiled in polite inquiry. Julian Croft probed for details about the diary's acquisition, his questions laced with a professional skepticism that barely concealed his ravenous curiosity. Elena Vance deflected his inquiries with a cool efficiency, acting as the steadfast guardian of her mentor's secrets. Sterling Blackwood remained largely silent, a granite monolith of inscrutable thought, while Beatrice Holloway seemed to shrink further into her corner, her presence as unobtrusive as a watermark on old paper. Professor Finch, for his part, seemed to revel in the suspense. He parried questions with vague, tantalizing hints, his energy seemingly renewed by the intellectual combat and the port he continued to sip. It was shortly after the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 10 that the evening took its dark, inevitable turn. Professor Finch had just finished a rather pointed anecdote about an academic rival who had been disgraced for fabricating sources, a story that made Julian Croft shift uncomfortably in his seat. He raised his glass for another sip, his hand trembling more noticeably now. He paused, his eyes widening slightly. A strange, puzzled expression crossed his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a soft, guttural sigh escaped. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the polished floorboards, a splash of deep red pooling on the Persian rug like a sudden wound. Then, with a slow, almost graceful motion, his head slumped to one side, his body going limp in the great winged chair. For a moment there was a stunned, absolute silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ceaseless moan of the wind. It was Elena who moved first. She let out a sharp, choked cry and rushed to his side, her face a mask of disbelief. "Professor," Alistair, she felt for a pulse at his neck, her fingers trembling. Her eyes, wide with horror, lifted to meet ours. I don't think he's breathing. Julian Croft, his face pale, knelt beside her. After a moment he looked up, his professional charm utterly gone, replaced by a raw, naked shock. "He's gone," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He's dead." Pandemonium, in a restrained, academic sort of way, erupted. Blackwood rose to his feet, his heavy face grim. "The telephone is out. We're cut off completely." Beatrice Holloway let out a small, mousy gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. My own mind, the journalist's instinct taking over, began to race. One does not simply drop dead in a room full of rivals immediately after teasing the discovery of a lifetime. Ah, but my dear reader, the truth is often disguised in the ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about this. "We mustn't touch anything," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. It cut through the rising panic. "This is a crime scene." The word hung in the air, ugly and incongruous amidst the scent of old books and beeswax. "A crime," scoffed Julian, though his eyes were wide and fearful. The man was 75 and in poor health. It was his heart, surely. He was speaking lucidly moments before, I countered, my gaze fixed on the shattered glass and the dark stain on the rug. And he drank from that glass, his final act. The implication was clear. Poison. A classic silent killer, leaving behind a room full of suspects, each with a plausible reason for wanting the old man out of the way. With Finch dead, the fate of the Thorn diary was now a terrifyingly open question. Did he reveal its location? Did one of us already know? The diary was no longer just a key to the past. It had become the motive for murder. We moved his body with a shared, grim reluctance to the long leather sofa against the far wall, covering him with a cashmere throw. It felt a profoundly inadequate gesture. Then, the investigation, such as it was, began. We were not detectives, but we were scholars, trained to dissect texts and unearth hidden truths. Now we had to apply those skills to the most impenetrable text of all, a murder. My gaze swept the room, looking for anything out of place. One must always train the eye to see what is there, not merely what one expects to be there. The library was immaculate, a testament to Finch's fastidious nature. The fire had been recently tended. The decanter of port stood on the table, half empty. Beside it lay a small, leather-bound volume. It was the diary. Finch must have placed it there while we were distracted. The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. It lay there inert, yet pulsing with a malevolent power. Julian reached for it, his hand shaking slightly. "We must see what's inside. It's the key to all this." "No," Elena's voice was sharp, cutting. "It belongs to him. To his estate, we have no right." Her grief was evident, but it was tangled with a fierce, protective instinct. Was she protecting his legacy or a secret within those pages? I stepped between them. "Dr. Vance is right. We should not disturb it, but we must establish the facts. Who was near the decanter? Who had the opportunity to tamper with it?" Everyone, it seemed. The decanter had been on the side table all evening. Elena had poured the first glass, but any of us could have approached it on the pretext of admiring a book or warming our hands by the fire. We looked at each other, and for the first time the scholarly rivalry in our eyes was replaced by something far colder. Suspicion. Each of us was mentally retracing the evening, replaying conversations, searching for a gesture, a movement, a moment of distraction that could have provided the opportunity. I decided to take the lead. It is a journalist's habit to ask the questions no one else wants to. "Dr. Vance," I began, my tone gentle but firm, "you poured the professor's glass. Did you notice anything unusual, an odd smell, a residue in the decanter?" She shook her head, her face pale and drawn. "No, nothing, it was just as it always is. He had a glass of port every evening. It was his ritual." Her voice broke on the last word. "And who else was near that table?" I pressed. Sterling Blackwood spoke, his voice a low rumble. "We all were at one point or another." "I was examining the folio on that stand," he said, gesturing with his chin. "It's less than 5 feet away." Julian Croft bridled. Are you suggesting something, Blackwood? I am stating a fact, Croft, Blackwood replied coolly. Just as you were over there, pontificating about Tudor architecture within arm's reach of the sherry and the port, my attention turned to the quietest person in the room. Dr. Holloway, where were you? Beatrice Holloway flinched as if struck. All eyes turned to her. I remained in my chair, I never moved. Her voice was a bare whisper, her eyes wide and frightened, like a rabbit caught in the glare of a lantern. But was it the fear of an innocent, or the fear of being discovered? An hour later, the body lay cold on the sofa, a silent, reproachful presence. We had searched the immediate area for any vial or packet, any container that might have held a poison, but found nothing. The killer, it seemed, had been careful. Our initial unity in shock had fractured, splintering into suspicion and fear. Every creak of the old house, every shriek of the wind outside, seemed to amplify the tension within. The library, once a haven of intellectual pursuit, had become a cage. A cage with a corpse, a priceless diary, and 5 people, one of whom was a murderer. The storm showed no signs of abating. There would be no police, no escape until the morning, if even then. We were alone with our secrets, and the game, as Professor Finch would have appreciated, was afoot. And I, for one, intended to solve it. One must always consider the little grey cells, and mine were working furiously, sifting through the lies, the half-truths, and the carefully constructed facades of my fellow prisoners. The night was far from over. The long, dark hours of the night were a crucible. Sleep was an impossibility. The library, with its silent, shrouded figure on the sofa, had become a tomb. We retreated into ourselves, the initial shock congealing into a thick, pervasive dread. Each of us, I am certain, was re-examining the faces of our companions, searching for the faintest crack in the mask of civility, the telltale glint of guilt. Ah, but dear reader, the most accomplished actors are not found on the stage, but in the drawing rooms, or in this case the libraries, of polite society. My own mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. Poison in the port seemed the most likely method. It was simple, quiet, and exploited the victim's own habits. But who possessed both the means and the motive? The motive, it seemed, was sitting on the table, bound in cracked leather, the Thorn diary. Everyone had a reason to want it. Julian to publish it and achieve the fame he craved. Elena to secure her mentor's legacy, or perhaps to suppress something within its pages that tarnished his name. Blackwood to protect his family's honor from a centuries-old scandal. Even the meek Dr. Holloway, the archivist. Perhaps the diary contained a detail that would validate a forgotten theory of hers, a chance to finally step out of the shadows. But motive is not proof. Opportunity was the more difficult question. As Blackwood had pointed out, we had all been moving about the room. A skilled hand could have administered a poison in a matter of seconds. I closed my eyes, trying to reconstruct the evening. The little grey cells must be put to work methodically. I recalled Julian Croft, gesticulating with his sherry glass near the side table. I saw Sterling Blackwood, his large frame momentarily blocking my view of the decanter as he leaned over to inspect a map. I saw Elena, her movements so fluid and natural as she served her mentor. And I saw Beatrice Holloway, still and silent in her chair. She claimed she never moved, but could anyone truly vouch for that? In a room full of distractions, the person who attracts the least attention often has the most freedom to act. A thought struck me. The glass, I said aloud, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. The one the professor drank from. We left the pieces on the floor. We all looked at the spot on the rug. The shattered remains of the crystal glass lay there, glinting in the firelight. What of it? Julian asked, his tone frayed. When Dr. Vance poured the port, she brought the glass directly to him. The poison, if there was one, could have been in the glass itself, not the decanter. Every head swiveled to look at Elena. Her face, already pale, turned ashen. That's monstrous, she whispered. I would never, he was everything to me. Grief can make people do irrational things, Julian murmured, not unkindly, but the seed of suspicion had been replanted. As can ambition, Elena retorted, her eyes flashing with a spark of their earlier fire. To break the escalating tension, I decided on a new course of action. We cannot solve this by simply accusing one another. We must be systematic. Let us search the professor's desk. Perhaps he left a note, or perhaps we can find out more about the diary. It felt like a violation, but necessity is a harsh mistress. With a shared reluctance, we moved towards the great oak desk at the far end of the room. It was, like its owner, impeccably organized. A stack of papers, neatly squared, a fountain pen in its holder. A silver letter opener, sharp enough to be a weapon in its own right. As Elena, who knew his habits best, began to check the drawers, my eyes were drawn to the overflowing wastepaper basket beside the desk. Trivialities, I have always found, are often where the truth lies hiding. While the others were focused on the drawers, I discreetly knelt and began to sift through the discarded scraps. Most were innocuous, drafts of letters, publishers' circulars. But then I found it, a small, crumpled ball of paper. I smoothed it out on my knee. It was a telegram, or rather a draft of one, written in Finch's spidery hand. The message was brief. HOLLOWAY deception confirmed. You were right. Proof is in the diary. Proceed with exposure. My blood ran cold. Holloway. I glanced over at the quiet archivist, who was watching the search of the desk with wide, seemingly innocent eyes. A deception. What deception? Suddenly, her presence was no longer a simple matter of professional consultation. She was connected to this in a way none of us had imagined. I folded the piece of paper and slipped it into my pocket. To reveal it now would be to show my hand too early. I needed more information. Just then, Blackwood let out a low exclamation. What's this? He had opened the wide, shallow drawer in the center of the desk. Tucked at the back, beneath a stack of blotters, was a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay an antique syringe. A small vial filled with a clear, viscous liquid lay beside it. My God, Julian breathed. He was injecting himself with something. Elena stared at the box, her expression a mixture of confusion and pain. It's for his heart, she said softly. His doctor prescribed it, an emergency treatment. He was to use it if he felt an attack coming on. He hated it. He said it was a surrender. So Alistair Finch had a severe heart condition. It lent credence to the theory of natural causes. But it also presented another, more sinister possibility. The poison might not have been in the port at all. What if the killer had known about this medication? They could have replaced the life-saving drug with a lethal substance, knowing that when the professor felt unwell, he would unwittingly administer his own death blow. But he hadn't used the syringe. He had died in his chair. Did he seem unwell before he drank the port? I asked Elena. She thought for a moment. He seemed tired, more frail than usual. But when he started talking about the diary, he grew animated. He seemed strong. This was a puzzle. If he was feeling unwell, why reach for the port instead of his medicine? Unless the poison was a fast-acting agent that mimicked the symptoms of a heart attack. The victim, feeling the initial effects, might not have had time to reach for the syringe. He would simply collapse. It was a cunning, diabolical method. My mind kept returning to the crumpled telegram. Holloway deception confirmed. I needed to speak with Dr. Holloway, but I needed to do it carefully. I found my opportunity when Julian and Blackwood engaged in a hushed, heated debate over the legal ramifications of the diary's ownership. And Elena sat by the fire, lost in her own sorrowful thoughts. I approached the archivist's corner. Dr. Holloway, I began quietly. This is a dreadful business. She nodded, not meeting my eyes. Dreadful. You knew Professor Finch for a long time, I believe, beyond just professional consultations. Her head snapped up, a flicker of panic in her eyes. No, not at all. I have only met him on a handful of occasions. When the university required my authentication services. She was lying. The telegram implied a much deeper, more contentious history. Her denial was clumsy, too quick. Strange, I mused, keeping my tone light. He mentioned your name to me once, in connection with your father. The reaction was instantaneous and profound. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a sickly, papery white. Her hands, clasped in her lap, began to tremble violently. My father. Yes, he was an academic as well, wasn't he? A contemporary of Finch S. She swallowed hard. He died many years ago, a climbing accident. An accident. Or was it? The little grey cells were beginning to connect the dots. A decades-old rivalry, a mysterious death, a secret hidden in a 17th century diary, and a crumpled telegram confirming a deception. The scope of this crime, I was beginning to realize, was far greater than a simple dispute over a historical document. The murder of Alistair Finch was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of a very old one. Before I could press her further, Julian's voice, sharp with excitement, cut through the room. "I've found it." He was holding the Thorn diary, his earlier compunctions clearly forgotten. He had opened it to a page near the end. "Listen to this. It's an entry from 1698. Thorn describes a secret agreement, a land grant fraud assigned by two of the colony's most prominent figures. One of them was Phineas Blackwood." Sterling Blackwood went rigid. He strode over to Julian, his face a thundercloud, and snatched the diary from his hands. He read the page, his lips a thin, hard line. "This is a forgery." "A slander, is it?" Julian shot back, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase. "Or is it the reason the Blackwood family has been so powerful for 300 years? Is that what you were afraid Finch would expose, Blackwood, afraid enough to kill him?" Blackwood turned, his massive frame radiating menace. For a moment, I thought he might strike Julian. The library, our prison, had just become infinitely more dangerous. The diary had claimed its first victim, and now it was turning the survivors against each other like starving wolves. The truth was in that room, but so was a lie, a carefully crafted deception, and I had to unravel it before the killer decided to tidy up any loose ends, one of which I was beginning to suspect was me. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous as a London fog. Sterling Blackwood's face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes held a flicker of something else. Fear. The diary was not merely an academic curiosity for him. It was a stick of dynamite placed at the foundations of his entire world. "You are a contemptible ghoul, Croft," Blackwood bit out, his voice a low growl. "Picking over a dead man's papers for a sordid headline. The truth is rarely tidy, Blackwood," Julian retorted, undeterred. He was a man who scented a story, and a cornered animal is often less dangerous than a journalist on the trail of a career-making exposé. But I found my attention drifting from this new, explosive revelation. It felt too convenient, too perfectly theatrical. A murder is a messy, passionate business born of human frailty. While the ruin of a family name is a powerful motive, this felt like a distraction. It was a red herring, I was almost certain of it, and a particularly potent one. My mind kept returning to the quiet archivist and the crumpled telegram. Holloway deception confirmed. The night wore on. We were a small, frayed band of unwilling Confederates, bound by terror and suspicion. No one dared to touch the port or the sherry now. We subsisted on water from a carafe that I insisted on pouring myself, in full view of everyone. At some point, exhaustion claimed us in shifts. I saw Julian doze off in a chair, his head lolling, only to snap awake moments later, his eyes darting around the room. Elena kept her vigil by the fire, a solitary figure of grief, her gaze fixed on the flames as if she could find an answer in their dance. It was during one of these lulls, when the silence was broken only by the storm and Blackwood's heavy breathing, that I noticed a small detail. One must always pay attention to the insignificant, for it is there that the culprit so often makes his mistake. On the floor, near the chair where Beatrice Holloway had sat so rigidly all evening, lay a small, dark object. It was a woman's hairpin, a simple black one, but Dr. Holloway's hair was held in a severe bun, fastened with a large tortoiseshell clasp. I had not seen her wear any other pins. Under the pretext of stretching my legs, I wandered over and discreetly picked it up. It was strangely heavy for its size. I examined it in the palm of my hand. The tip was unusually sharp, needle-like, and there was a faint, almost invisible discoloration near the point. My heart began to pound. It was not a hairpin. It was a tool, perhaps, or a weapon of exquisite subtlety. One could conceal a drop of poison on that tip, and in the act of, say, steadying a glass for an elderly, trembling hand, administer the fatal dose. A tiny puncture, a scratch on the skin, would be all it took for a potent, fast-acting neurotoxin. It would be virtually undetectable. This changed everything. The shattered port glass could have been a piece of misdirection. Perhaps the poison was never in the drink at all, but was administered by a minute prick to Finch's hand as he accepted the glass from Elena. But the pin was found near Dr. Holloway's chair. I had to confront her. The time for subtlety was over. I drew her aside to the far end of the library by a window where the snow-laced wind pressed against the glass. "Dr. Holloway," I said, my voice low. "Your father, the climbing accident. It happened in the Alps, did it not, 30 years ago?" She stared at me, her face utterly devoid of expression. It was the unnerving calm of someone who has passed beyond fear. "Yes. Alastair Finch was with him on that trip," I stated. It was a guess, a shot in the dark, but a logical one. She did not flinch. "He was. There was an inquiry," I pressed on, the pieces clicking into place with a dreadful certainty. "Finch was the only witness. He said your father's rope had frayed, that it was a tragic, unforeseeable accident. That was his story," she said, her voice flat and cold. The little grey cells were firing now, a cascade of deduction. "But you never believed it. Your father and Finch were rivals, were they not? Competing for the same prestigious chair at the university. A chair that Finch conveniently secured after your father's death. You believe Finch cut that rope." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. A deep, abiding hatred that was chilling in its intensity. "He murdered him. He murdered my father for a professorship and left me an orphan. I have known it my entire life. But I could never prove it. Until now," I whispered, understanding dawning. "The Thorn Diary, that's the deception Finch mentioned in his telegram. It has nothing to do with Phineas Blackwood, does it?" A thin, cruel smile touched her lips. "Of course not. That was my little addition. A bit of theatrical flair for Mr. Croft and his ilk. A forgery is a simple matter for an experienced archivist." I knew it would send them all barking up the wrong tree. She had planted the fake entry about the Blackwood family to create a smokescreen, to provide a host of alternative suspects and motives. It was brilliant. It was diabolical. "The real secret," I continued, piecing it together, "is something else entirely. What did Thorn's diary truly contain?" "Thorn was an amateur botanist," Beatrice said, her voice now filled with a triumphant calm. "He kept detailed notes on the flora of New England. He documented a rare mountain flower, a species of nightshade, whose berries contain a potent, fast-acting cardiotoxin. A poison that leaves almost no trace and perfectly mimics the symptoms of a massive coronary. Thorn noted that the plant grew only on one specific mountain in this region. The very same mountain where Alastair Finch took my father on his final climb. The whole ghastly puzzle locked into place. Finch found the diary years ago. He read that passage. It gave him the idea, the means. He used the berries from that plant to poison your father, and then invented the story of the frayed rope. And when he acquired the diary recently, you knew it contained the proof you needed. Not proof of murder, but proof of his knowledge. Proof that he was on that mountain with access to a perfect, untraceable poison. It was the missing piece of your puzzle. He invited me here to authenticate his great discovery," she said, her eyes gleaming with a cold fire. "The irony is quite delicious, isn't it? He summoned his own executioner. He was going to expose my deception, my years of quietly accusing him in academic circles. He had no idea I was about to expose his. So you killed him," I said. It was not a question. "I administered justice," she corrected me. 30 years late, but justice nonetheless. I used the same poison he used on my father. I synthesized it myself from samples in the university's botanical collection. A single drop on the tip of this. She opened her hand, and in her palm lay a second, identical needle-sharp pin. I pricked his hand as he reached for his chair after a coughing fit. He barely noticed. By the time he sat down and drank his port, the toxin was already in his blood. The shattered glass, the drama, all a wonderful bit of theatre to confuse the issue. The sheer, cold-blooded audacity of it was breathtaking. She had planned this for years, a slow, patient revenge. She had woven a web of such complexity, with false clues and misdirection, that we had all been caught in it, scurrying around like frantic insects while she, the spider, watched from the center. Just as the confession left her lips, the library door creaked open. Sterling Blackwood stood there, his face grim. He had heard everything. Beatrice Holloway did not look surprised. She simply smiled that thin, chilling smile again. "It seems the performance is over," she said softly. The howling of the wind outside seemed to be her only applause. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, the prelude to a final, desperate act in our deadly play. The final act did not play out with the violence I had anticipated. There was no lunge for a weapon, no desperate struggle. The confrontation was one of wills, a quiet, tense standoff in the heart of the snowbound library. Sterling Blackwood's imposing figure filled the doorway, his face a study in grim comprehension. He had sought to protect his family's name from a historical stain, only to find himself witness to the confession of a murder rooted in a much more recent and personal act of treachery. "You are a monster, Beatrice," he said, his voice low and heavy with disgust. She met his gaze without flinching, a small, unassuming woman who now seemed to possess a terrifying strength. "And what was Alistair Finch?" she retorted. "A man who built a celebrated career on the corpse of my father. I simply balanced the scales. Justice, Mr. Blackwood, is a concept the law often fails to grasp. I chose a more direct approach." Ah, but my dear reader, is it ever so simple? The human heart is a labyrinth of justification. We can convince ourselves of any truth if it serves to quell the demons of our own conscience. Beatrice Holloway had appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner, and in her mind, her cause was righteous. Before the standoff could escalate, the unmistakable sound of a heavy engine grinding through snow reached us from outside. Headlights cut through the swirling blizzard, sweeping across the library windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The snowplow, and behind it the flashing blue and red lights of the police. The storm had broken. Our isolation was over. The arrival of the authorities was a strange, almost anticlimactic affair. The world of order and procedure intruded upon our hermetically sealed chamber of chaos. Statements were taken, hushed and halting. Beatrice Holloway offered no resistance. She repeated her confession to the grim-faced detective, her tone flat and matter-of-fact, as if she were dictating a catalogue entry for a rare manuscript. She explained the forged passage in the diary, the true significance of the botanical entry, and the needle-prick method of delivering the poison. She was, in her own meticulous way, proud of her work. They took her away, a small grey figure swallowed by the flashing lights and the still-falling snow. As the door closed behind her, a profound and weary silence settled over the library once more. The body of Professor Finch was removed with professional quietude, leaving only a dark stain on the rug and the ghost of his presence in the great winged chair. Julian Croft, his face pale, looked at the Thorn diary which now lay on the desk, an object of evidence. So the Blackwood scandal, it was all a lie, a fabrication, a brilliantly conceived red herring, I affirmed, designed to give everyone else a powerful motive, to turn us against one another while the true killer watched from the shadows. Julian shook his head, a look of grudging admiration in his eyes. To think all this time I was chasing a phantom, a ghost story she invented. His ambition had made him the perfect pawn in her game. Elena Vance, who had remained silent throughout the final confrontation, finally spoke, her voice thick with a dawning, terrible understanding. "All these years, she whispered, staring at the chair where her mentor had died. All these years he was a fraud, a murderer. I dedicated my life to a man who was a lie. The foundation of her world had crumbled to dust, a far crueler fate, perhaps, than the prison cell that awaited Beatrice Holloway. In the end, there were no victors in that library, only varying degrees of loss. A life taken in revenge for a life stolen 30 years before. A family name, Blackwoods, cleared of a 17th century crime but forever linked to this new tragedy. A promising career, Elena S., poisoned by a mentor's devastating secret. A vainglorious ambition, Julian's, thwarted and made foolish by a dead woman's cunning. As I prepared to leave, I took one last look around the magnificent room. The books stood silent on their shelves, keepers of a million secrets, now harboring one more. The fire had died down to embers, a faint red glow in the hearth. The case of the deadly diary was closed. It was a tragedy born of the very thing this room was meant to celebrate, the obsessive, all-consuming pursuit of knowledge and legacy. Alastair Finch had killed for it, and in the end, it had killed him. The sins of the past, I reflected, have a terrible way of coming due. And sometimes, the most unassuming-looking volume can contain the deadliest story of all.